So welcome everyone to our conversation today. I just want to begin by saying that I believe I can safely say that the majority of people in attendance have some connection to Providence College. Whether you are or were a student, faculty, staff member, relative to someone in attendance at Providence College, or simply you are just here because you might have entered the wrong Zoom meeting ID, if so, feel free to stay. This dialogue is essential to the community of Providence College. It's also essential to the community of Providence, Rhode Island, and to the global community as a whole. As people will enter and leave, I do want to go over some Zoom rules before I introduce our wonderful speaker. Today's series will last around 40 minutes. So due to timing, we would like to reserve all questions towards the end of this conversation. By doing so, we do have a quick Q&A section on the Zoom webinar. So feel free to answer your question or ask your question in the Zoom and the Q&A section below. You'll see that. We want to refrain from using the chat section just to make sure everyone's attention is on the conversation. So like I said, all questions and answers, please just put them in the Q&A box below and we will answer them at the end. So hello everyone and welcome to the Providence College Anti-Racism 2020 Summer Series. My name is Jolssen Rodriguez and I will be the moderator for today's session. I am a rising senior, and I always pause saying senior because to me, it still freaks me out a little bit. It's happening so fast. But I will be majoring in public community service and global studies, as well as women and gender studies minor. I am blessed to have the experience as being the current Shepherd president and the current vice president for the Board of Multicultural Student Affairs this upcoming year. These two organizations work very closely with the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which is now my time to introduce the presenters of these series. So the PC Anti-Racism 2020 Summer Series offers critical learning opportunities to the entire Providence College community on topics related to race, ethnicity, systemic racism, white supremacy, and how we can cultivate practices that support anti-racism as an essential way of seeing, knowing, and living in the spirit of Veritas. This series is presented by the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and other campus partners. The first portion of today's presentation will be recorded and archived for future use. Please utilize the Q&A feature on Zoom webinar to ask any questions, and during the Q&A portion of the program, we will try to answer as many of these questions as we can. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Chambers. Dr. Chris Chambers Dr. Chris Chambers' research uses an intersectional lens to understand the ways that gender and sexuality influence the production of individual and collective Black identities. His work examines the various ideologies, cultural norms, interpretations, and experiences of racism and anti-racist struggle that influence the direction and content of Blackness while trying to shed light on the inconsistencies, paradoxes, tensions, and diversity of Black life as it is lived in America. He has written on social theories of racism and on Black gay men's identities. At Providence College, Dr. Chambers teaches undergraduate classes in introductory sociology and social theory. He is currently advising students to their path in sociology at Providence College, and I have been personally able to see the outstanding efforts Dr. Chambers puts in all of his work, since he is personally advising me through my undergrad summer research on the impacts of US immigration policy on LGBTQ+ migrants on the southern border. As we continue to navigate through these times, I would like to, without further ado, am very excited to welcome Dr. Chris Chambers and his work on what is systemic racism and why does it matter.
Thank you, Jolssen. I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. If you'll give me a second. And there we go. All right. I want to just make a few remarks before I get started. And the first is to thank and welcome everybody here today. I'm very, very honored, very humbled to have the opportunity to speak with everyone and to sort of share some ideas about this particular topic. I also want to dedicate my talk to the students, particularly those students that have been working tirelessly and with great courage to attempt to build a more inclusive Providence College campus. I want them to know that I stand in solidarity with them in their efforts. I also want to make a couple of comments about sort of my motivation for choosing this particular topic. Before I was a sociologist, I worked in higher ed administration, and I spent a large portion of that time doing work on diversity education and training. And throughout that entire 12 or so year period, I never once heard the term systemic racism. That didn't happen until I started graduate school in sociology. And since then, I have heard the term everywhere. I've heard it on television, I've heard it from politicians, I've heard it from journalists, pundits, even people in everyday conversation. And what I've found is that that term is highly debated. It is oftentimes misunderstood. It is certainly misused. And I thought it would be valuable for us, particularly given the things that are going on, for us to have a conversation about what does the term actually mean? How is it used, particularly by academics and so particularly sociologists who are trying to use the term to help us come to a much better understanding of the way in which race and racism work in our world today. My goal for today, or my agenda for today, is actually developed based upon the work of my two previous speakers, Drs. Mendoza and Drs. Dillon. I want to thank you both for giving me such a strong foundation to build off of. I'm going to incorporate many of the ideas and comments that they made during their talks. And I thought to sort of situate us, I would begin by actually building off of something that Dr. Dillon spoke about in her presentation, which was about the way in which becoming an anti-racist requires us to notice sometimes imperceptible and invisible things that shape our behavior and our culture. In my courses, I tell students that this is the work that sociologists do. In other words, to notice the imperceptible and the invisible. And so I want to first begin by giving you some idea about how sociologists think and how we look at things. From there, we'll talk about what systemic racism is, look at some of its claims and assumptions before turning to a case study where we'll basically look at how would systemic racism attempt to make sense of the current state of sort of policing in America, and then we'll take questions. So let's begin. I wanted to start off, I think, by asking a reflection question. And I want you to take a moment and think about how would you answer the question, what is racism? All right, so think about what words come to mind, what kinds of concepts come to mind, experiences, behaviors, what kinds of images. I'd imagine that for most of you, the term itself brings to mind images of the Klan, or perhaps of neo-Nazis. Maybe you think about white nationalists, or more recently, you might be thinking about the alt-right or the Proud Boys. You might even be thinking about perhaps the militia movement. Now, and these groups come to mind because I think our basic understanding of racism focuses on actions, actions that are particularly overt, malicious, intentional, maybe inadvertent, but certainly intentional in some way, right? And this fits, I think, our general view that racism is fundamentally about bad people or people doing bad things. And I think that this is also consistent with the conversation that Dr. Mendoza walked us through a few weeks ago, in which he talked about implicit bias, and he offered us some insight into how that kind of bad behavior, perhaps, right, is a function of the stereotypes that we learn in our society that then generate prejudiced points of view or perspectives in an individual that then lead to discriminatory behavior toward other folks. And that oftentimes this can happen at a really unconscious level, hence implicit bias. But I want to argue that I think that while useful, that this particular framework helps us to only understand part of the question or part of the issue, right? And I say that because implicit bias is a really useful way of understanding the action of individuals, right? What do people do? How do people think? But if you think about this more deeply, none of us as an individual, none of us as people tends to exist in sort of isolation. We, in fact, as individuals, exist as a part of a variety of groups, institutions, cultures, our family, our educational system, the legal system, and we are both participants in these things as well as co-creators of them. And more importantly, each of these settings, each of these contexts that we participate in also carry with them a set of expectations, norms, rules that we're taught and urged to follow. Sometimes they can be clear, like when a parent corrects a child, but sometimes they're not so obvious. So for example, in my introductory sociology course every year, I will ask students to reflect on how do we get food in a food court? And with some prompting, they'll eventually describe going into a food court, deciding where they want to eat, getting on the end of the line. When it's their turn, they order their food, pay for their food, take their food, and go sit down and eat it. And I asked them eventually to talk about how they learned this. And what I want them to take away from the exercise is that we behave in this way at a food court, not because there's signage in every food court that tells you what to do. Instead, the rules are actually unwritten and unspoken, but they still govern our behavior, and we're expected to follow them if we want to participate. We might learn them from our families or from our friends, or if you've ever been in a food court and gotten any of that wrong, you know that you can also learn it from the other people who are there, who will be happy to correct you, although not always in the most polite of ways. And when we think about all that, we call this in sociology the social structure, right? This collection of rules and norms and expectations that we follow. And I tell my students that while the structure may not always be visible or easy to see, it's there. It is evident in the underlying patterns of behavior and sort of action that take place around us all the time. And what it means is that our decisions, our choices, our behaviors don't emerge from an infinite set of possibilities. They are in fact bounded by what society expects of us or what it makes possible, right? We'll talk more about that later. So I think what that means is if we turn back to the question we started with, what is racism? If we use an individual framework to understand that question, we might ask why and in what ways is somebody racist? But if we look at it from a sociological framework, the question we would probably ask is oops, sorry, there we go. And in what ways is society organized to produce racism? Now, this isn't meant to deny the choices of individuals, but it's meant to acknowledge several realities. One is that racist behaviors, big or small, implicit or explicit, are outcomes of a society organized to produce those behaviors, to see them as acceptable or normal or beneath even notice. It means that for racism to function, we need not necessarily rely on bad actors, because once we've produced those norms or those rules in the context of schooling or housing policy or healthcare policy, for example, right, that they will continue to flourish, sometimes often beneath our notice. And it becomes important for us to then notice them, to cease to be complicit with them, and then perhaps to unbuild the society so that those things no longer function in the way that they do. It's really all about seeing how power is allocated and used in society, and this is what systemic racism is designed to really try to help us to understand. So now that we've had an opportunity to go move through introductory sociology, let me turn more directly to the concept of systemic racism. I want to begin with a definition, and I think that the one definition that I probably would use to describe what systemic racism is to say that it is the political, social, and economic arrangements of a society that produce racial hierarchy, which can be described as the inequitable distribution of resources and opportunities along racial lines. And it does this via the operation of the rules, norms, laws, beliefs, or values of a society that are evident in its organizations and institutions, right? I want to say that this concept is noteworthy in the history of sociology because at the early part of the discipline, scholars attempted to understand racism largely from the perspective of aberrant social behavior. Racists were somehow people behaving strangely. And that the research tended to try to understand how people became racist or developed racist attitudes, what inspired them to act on those ideas, to what extent certain features of group dynamics or social status shaped the sort of conditions that became racist action. And it wasn't until after the civil rights movement when many scholars began to notice that racism persisted in American society, despite the fact that there were no longer laws to protect it or to demand it, that people began to think that we needed to have a much deeper analysis about what racism is and how it functions. And that this new analysis could explain what that racism was, why it existed in this post-civil rights era, and in what ways our systems, our structure, as it were, was put together in a way that allowed it to be maintained over that period of time. Let me try to explain this or sort of illustrate it in a more practical way. And if you'll bear with me, I want to use a bit of a metaphor. Let's assume that you are about to buy a house, right? It's a nice, cute little cottage, 2 stories. It's got a nice, spacious living room. It's got an updated kitchen with an ample counter space and cabinetry. It even has a wonderful set of bedrooms that are very spacious, a nice bathroom that's been recently updated, and it even has a really nice sort of partially finished basement because, well, the kids have to have some place to play when it's raining outside, right? So that minus some cosmetic changes, the house seems fine to you, right? Maybe even perfect. Um, Now let's imagine if you were doing this and you lived in a wheelchair, right? You would find that suddenly this incredibly perfect house, maybe is less than perfect. That spacious living room, not so much useful to you because you're not going to be able to get into the house because there are stairs at the front. That really wonderfully remodeled kitchen, you can't probably reach any of those upper level cabinets. You may not even be able to reach the countertops. Forget the spacious bedrooms because you can't get upstairs. You can't even get upstairs to use the bathroom. And you're probably never going to get a chance to see or use the partially finished basement that you thought was such a great sort of addition to the home. And imagine if rather than have people acknowledge the limitations of this house for you to be able to live in it or offer suggestions for how to remake the house, they would tell you, well, that's just the way houses are made. Or if you tried hard enough, you'd be able to live in it. Or why do you complain so much about houses, right? And imagine if this was your experience everywhere that you went to go look at a house. And you realize that everyone that lived in a wheelchair had to deal with these kinds of experiences. You would be frustrated that what other people didn't notice, that there's something wrong with the way we build houses. There's something wrong with the structure, right? And it's the ability to notice that becomes important in being able to fundamentally address it, right? Maybe we could build houses a different way, right? So this is, again, what sort of systemic racism attempts to try to deal with or to understand. And I thought it'd be helpful as a way of articulating some of its claims and assumptions to look at them more explicitly. So let's take a look. And in this area, I want to synthesize the work done by a number of scholars, some sociologists, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Jennifer Mueller, and my own mentor, Joe Fagan, as well as legal scholars, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic. People who work on systemic racism argue 5 key things. One, they argue that systemic racism, or that racism in general, is both foundational, historical, and ordinary. Foundational in the sense that there was tremendous violence and dehumanization done in the founding of America and throughout its history, much of which was actively discussed by founders, codified in important key documents and the law, formalized in the construction of America, and became the blueprint for the nation, in fact. There's no mention of Blacks in any of our founding documents other than as slaves. Native Americans are absent, right? And also, in many respects, the idea of race is enshrined in the protections that built the country. It is historical in the sense that if we want to understand racial dynamics today, we have to understand where they come from, their evolution. None of us are who we are today without the threads that connect us to who we were prior as children, as adolescents, young adults. Similarly, to understand the patterns of race and racism that exist today, we have to understand where they come from and that they're ordinary. I tell my students that we would fail to understand racism if we only sought out the extraordinary events. Racist structures, cultural norms, practices, policy, these are common features of American society. They're not aberrant add-ons. And as a result, the most insidious stuff actually happens right in front of us. Systemic racism also argues that racism is both hierarchical and divisive. So that race as an idea and as we conceive of it in our modern nation was created to justify things like imperialism and slavery. It was not created just as a way to sort of note differences among people, like flavors of ice cream. The concept had built into it ideas about the relative inferiority of certain racial groups relative to whites, and the idea that that meant that non-whites were less human, less civilized, less intelligent, and less blessed relative to whites. And this means that as a result, the idea of race has built into it notions about group identity and status that mean that giving and taking means, in fact, conflict. And so that's something that we have to sort of think about as well. In addition to that, the systemic racism argues that there are privileges and disadvantages built into racism. Once we have group interests and the idea that we allocate resources and opportunities in society according to those interests, that means that some people get at the expense of others. And sociologists, for example, and other social scientists have acknowledged that if we look at any single metric of social opportunity in our society, we'll find that whites outpace Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans in every single one of them, whether we're talking about health, education, income, wealth attainment, hiring, promotion, criminal justice, housing, etc. Right? So there is definitely this dynamic built into race, that there is a system of advantage and disadvantage that's connected to it. In addition to those ideas, Dr. Dillon raised in her comments the question about why don't we notice racism, or why don't we do anything to act? And she cited several examples of this in her work. And I think the answer to that question is about acknowledging that our society, or that more explicitly our culture, produces a belief system or a worldview that seeks to normalize racial inequality. It renders it invisible, or at the very least palatable, right? And typically it teaches us, particularly whites, to see it as a natural aspect of society, something that's not our fault, something which we should not be concerned about, or that can be readily explained away. In fact, in some writing about this, people talk about how our culture creates for us ready storylines for us to use when people confront us with claims about racism. We're taught to say, well, those people are naturally lazy, so that explains things. Or I don't see race, so that we can ignore what's going on. Or to disavow claims of racism as hyperbole or exaggeration. I mean, even in this age of video, we find that oftentimes when people will document events that are racist in nature and post the videos to social media, the commentary will include things, well, what happened before the video, right? Now, this happens in part because research indicates that we currently are living at one of the an era that is one of the most segregated in American history, where in effect, Blacks and whites and other people of color live fundamentally separated from each other. We worship fundamentally separated from each other. And as a consequence, there isn't sort of the firsthand knowledge, right, that many people who don't experience racism firsthand have to understand, see, or to notice it, because the relationships and the experiences that would allow that to happen are not in place. And the last claim that systemic racism makes is that racism is pervasive. In other words, that these cultural norms, these practices, these beliefs, these assumptions, they exist within the fabric of society at every place, every institution, every organization, every interaction is going to draw from this well that we have created and fundamentally as a society have chosen to ignore and to not really fundamentally address. Okay. So that's the basic framework of systemic racism. And as promised, I wanted to spend a little bit of time taking us on a sort of tour of how systemic racism as an idea, as a concept might explain something like the violence of police toward unarmed Black and other citizens. In fact, it is the killing of George Floyd that in fact brings us here into this particular series. And I think that this particular issue is a valuable one to look at because the evidence seems to indicate that more Blacks than any other group are killed. Well, not more Blacks in raw numbers, but the Blacks are much more likely to be killed by police in the course of police carrying out their duties. In fact, 3 times as much. If put another way, if Blacks are 13% of the population, they comprise 28% of the people killed by police. And statistics seem to indicate that since 2013, the number of people killed by police each year has been going up. So if we were using then systemic racism as a framework to try to make sense of this, versus, let's say, an individual framework, rather than ask the question, why did George Floyd die, right? Or why was he killed? We should ask the question instead, what factors in our society lead us to this place where many unarmed Black, and we can also say Latino and Native American men, women, and children are dying at the hands of police? I think to understand this, we have to think about the kinds of spaces, the neighborhoods in which many of these kinds of incidents occur, or in which the people who are sort of caught up in this frame of this phenomena tend to live. And this sort of typical inner city neighborhood, as it might be, how does it get to be so dangerous? And to answer that question, I want to rely heavily on arguments made by Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, as well as the website Mapping Police Violence and a report from the Witherspoon Institute, which I think all sort of speak incredibly well to this question. And I also want to say that I'm going to try to take us through a comprehensive but very quick and analysis. And so I'm not going to be able to sort of explain everything in detail. So maybe we can address some of this in the Q&A afterwards. So let's go back to this neighborhood. How do we get to a neighborhood in which this kind of violence takes place? And I think it's important to acknowledge first and foremost that this kind of a neighborhood was made by public policy. And it begins with how the neighborhood becomes impoverished. One input into that is redlining, a practice that begins in 1934 that establishes federally backed mortgage loans, and because it denied loans for the purchase of homes in neighborhoods that were deemed unresirable, largely because of the percentage of non-white residents, that meant that in effect, as home buying became the norm in American society for a large segment of the population, that most of those people who were able to do so were white, and most of those people who were able to do so did so in neighborhoods that were not inclusive of people who were not like them. The result of this was that it left in many urban areas a condition of white flight as residents began to leave these neighborhoods where these loans were not available to be made. And as a consequence, the values of those homes go down. There's a mass exodus into the suburbs where home values go up, and where, in many respects, these residents are looking for a promise that the conditions that created their need to leave the prior neighborhood are not going to be recreated. Unfortunately, what it also meant was that many of the businesses and the jobs that they held in cities also followed them out to the suburbs, all of which has a consequence on the tax base of this particular community. The result is that these communities lose services. They lose things like, they're all funded through property taxes. They lose access to funding schools, hospitals, fire, sanitation, even code enforcement. things we should think about when we think about why urban neighborhoods that are poor look the way that they do. And the result of all this is that it indicates a neighborhood of entrenched poverty. Um, People born here are going to be undereducated here, qualify for low-paying jobs that are still left here, and as they will grow old, they will die here, and then when they have children, their children will move through the same cycle, barring some lucky opportunity that will allow them to escape it. If we think about the conditions or the quality of this neighborhood, we have to acknowledge the fact that it'll be a neighborhood in which things like crime and drugs will be rampant. What's noteworthy here is that contrary to the popular belief that crime and drugs are highly associated with race, they are not. They're actually highly associated with poverty, where people in effect attempt to find access to alternative means for cash and will oftentimes try to escape the sort of conditions in which they live through the use of substances. In fact, the data on criminal behavior tells us that depending on the crime, that either blacks and whites commit crime at basically equal levels, or that whites actually commit more crime than blacks do. But what it does, the belief that this is a sort of racialized thing, is it creates a bunch of stereotypes about these groups of people that become sort of the foundation of society and how we think about crime and how we therefore should address it. A 2016 report by the Justice Department found that Black people in Baltimore were much more likely to be stopped than white people in Baltimore, even when they controlled for the population. In that study, they cite one Black man in his mid-50s who was stopped 30 times in a 4-year period, about one stop a month, despite having never received a citation or criminal charge. That same report went on to talk about how police were much more likely with Black residents to use force, to target residents of color, to stop and ticket them, almost in every certain aspect of their policing, which gives us a sense then of how all of these things could begin to play out. And there are also examples of a phenomenon called broken windows policing, an idea that says the way to address crime, to address drugs, is to police certain neighborhoods, certain communities aggressively, with the idea that this is will deter more serious crimes. Ironically, the data tells us that that doesn't necessarily work. The culmination of all of this comes in the early 1990s, where we see the passage of the Omnibus Crime Bill in 1994. This is a bill that effectively not only encourages aggressive policing, it encourages aggressive sentencing. It gives police a great deal of discretion. It changes the sort of status of judicial proceedings to give even prosecutors more discretion. The sum total of the Omnibus Crime Bill is that we see an enormous uptick in incarceration of predominantly young Black men across America, all at a time, in fact, when violent crime in the United States was in fact going down. But it has huge impacts on the quality of life in these communities. Alexander even talks about that as a result of the sort of crime sort of bill and the drug war, that we even began to incentivize and monetize arrest for police jurisdiction agencies. Federal anti-crime funding and legislation was tied to arrest, to drug arrests in particular, which gave incentives to police to target and arrest individuals suspected of drug crimes as a way of bringing money and resources to the departments. These laws also saw the expansion of asset forfeiture laws. These were laws that were originally written with organized crime in mind. You get involved in organized crime and we can seize your assets as a way of sort of preventing that crime from taking place. These laws got applied to sort of drug crimes, and that allowed police departments to arrest people suspected of drug crimes and collect everything of value, their houses, their cars, their equipment, even the money in their wallets. And if convicted on a charge, they could keep those assets and sell them as a way of bringing sort of funding into their budgets. We also now see that more commonly, police are trained using military grade training and equipment. I was listening to an NPR sort of interview yesterday where one of the researchers was talking about that police training now tends to prime trainee police to see lethal danger everywhere, and to believe that if they shoot first, that they will save lives. And so as a consequence, it primes them to sort of be much more ready to use a weapon. In addition to that, if we go back to the omnibus crime bill, there are now federal grants and programs that make it possible for them to police in this way with the addition of SWAT teams, tanks, bazookas, grenade launchers, helicopters, and the like. In addition, we also have a situation where there is, that's one too many, where there's increased police discretion. If we think about the question of like, why are police to do things like stop and frisk or search someone without a warrant, or even claim in the aftermath of a shooting that they were only fearing for their lives, and so therefore lethal force was justified. This is because courts have increasingly over the years interpreted the law that governs policing in a way that says that even when it comes to individuals' constitutional rights, that police should be allowed the broadest discretion possible to do whatever they wish, premised on this idea that because their fundamental duty is to prevent crime, to prevent violence, which is often unpredictable and furtive, that they cannot have their hands tied in any way possible. Right. And then finally, we have to look at sort of what the practice of policing looks like in some other ways as well. So if we look at, for example, the culture of policing, and many of you may have already heard this about how policing as an institution starts in slave patrols. It even starts in Texas Rangers, who protected the interest of whites and were quite brutal in terms of their treatment of slaves and others. Which means that we have an institution that has a long history of enacting violence against Blacks, Mexicans, Native Americans, a history of using force, one that we particularly see when police were used to break up labor strikes in the most brutal and violent of ways. So this creates an institution where the use of force, the use of violence, particularly against those who are disenfranchised, is common and expected in many ways. And in fact, in 2006, the FBI issued a report stating that white supremacists and skinheads were infiltrating America's police forces. And despite that, there's been little effort to actually try to address that. There is, of course, as well among police officers, this informal code, the blue wall of silence, that basically tells officers do not report on colleagues' errors or misconduct or crime. And if you choose to do so, you can risk, in fact, losing the support of your fellow officers, which is detrimental when you're out in the field trying to save lives. We also have to think about the influence and power of police unions. In 2018, there was a University of Oxford study of the 100 largest American cities and found that the extent of protections that that unions have achieved for police in their contracts was a direct and positive correlation to the amount of violence that police mete out against citizens. Contracts over the years have added so many protections for police that it has effectively shielded bad cops from discipline. These contracts have opposed things like background checks against potential police officers, called for the erasure of disciplinary records, sometimes in as short a period of time as 6 months. They've fought the creation of national databases so that if you are fired on misconduct in Seattle, that you can't then get hired in Atlanta like 2 days later because they would know about that misconduct. Now that does not happen. Even the grievance and arbitration procedures these contracts dictate are often sort of biased in favor of the officers in their discretion. There's also been increasing concern about qualified immunity, this doctrine that says that police officers, like other public officials, are not liable for breaking the law. And for many folks, this means that many police officers operate with a sense that they are, in fact, above the law. And in fact, qualified immunity has been used to shield departments and particular officers from investigation, in some cases, as well as to protect them from accountability, even when they're found responsible for wrongdoing. In fact, when we hear about payouts that are done in the wake of some type of wrongdoing by a police officer, it's worth noting that those payouts are not done by police departments, police unions, or individual police officers. Those payouts are done by taxpayers. And then finally, we have to acknowledge the fact that we really have poor access to data, that there are laws in place that actually require the collection of information about police, people who die in police custody. Those laws are in fact not well funded, and as a consequence, the data on who dies at the hands of police is not consistently kept. Um, and where we do have access to data, most scholars and even politicians argue that that data is not very reliable. There is lots of underreporting, there are lots of inaccuracies, and in fact, most people these days rely on a number of sort of independent sources to help us to keep tabs on the amount of violence that happens at the hands of police in America. Okay. So I wanted to paint this really comprehensive picture that when we ask the question, how is it that we come to a situation in which so many people of color end up dying at the hands of police, that question does not have a simple answer to it, that there are lots of inputs into that. Those inputs have a lot to do with the history of policing, have a lot to do with the current state of how policing works, as well as the sort of cultural inputs around who we think criminals are in society, how violent we think they are, and what kinds of means are required to stop it, particularly when on top of that, our belief is that there are some lives, perhaps maybe that have less value in these arrangements than do others. So I'm sure at this point, most of you are probably asking the question, well, how do we fix something like this? And I don't want to sort of lull you into a sense that the answer to that question is simple or easy. But I do want to make some effort to try to point a direction. And I think first and foremost, I have to say that we would really need to be, in order to sort of think about how do we undo something like this, we have to be really good listeners. A fundamental premise of becoming anti-racist is to notice, right? And particularly to notice things that we're not taught to notice, we're actively discouraged from noticing, then that means that we have to be the kind of people who are willing to not only notice, but listen to other people who are noticing and pay attention to what it is they're trying to tell us. There are some scholars who argue that in order for particularly whites to understand racism, they have to really sort of decenter their own experiences of the world and listen to the stories of people of color who encounter racism on a regular basis in order to understand that the world may be very well structured in a way that fits them and is comfortable for them, but not for everyone, right? So we have to be good listeners. But I think in addition to being good listeners, we have to learn. So that means that we have to be willing to acknowledge that sometimes that we have to shift our perspective. We have to shift our understanding. We have to have access and an openness to new information. And that once we do that, I think that's really what allows us to sort of go about diagnosing what is that needs to change. I used an example with a friend of mine the other day as I was sort of preparing for this talk to say, if any of us went to the doctor and said, the doctor, I don't feel well, and gave them our symptoms, none of us would want to hear the doctor say, oh, that sounds terrible. Well, good luck, or, I hope you feel better, or perhaps tell us why they think that we have gout when we just basically give them the symptoms, for the flu. We want someone who's going to listen to us, take that information and use it to make a diagnosis. And unless we're willing to listen and learn, we can't make a good diagnosis. Some of what we'll do, I think, in terms of prescription will be about changing laws and policies. We could do something very different, for example, about qualified immunity. We could do something very, very different about the power and role of police unions in our society. We could do something very different about the kinds of ways in which we afford resources to inner city communities. But none of that's going to happen easily. And I think that's why we need to think about not only the amount of transformation, but the fact that oftentimes what has been sort of consistently true in American society and history is that real change, real fundamental change is required active advocacy and pressure through the means of protest. If we think about any major change that we've experienced in our history, that's usually been the precursor to that change. And so that means that some people are going to have to, like, once they learn and once they understand, roll up their sleeves and do the work to really think about how to remake the society in a way that actually works for everyone. With that, I want to thank you for your time and attention this morning, or I guess this afternoon, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Chambers. We actually do have a couple questions already in line. For those who are still curious, there is a Q&A option below. All you have to do is just type your question. You can choose to submit it anonymously. All questions will be answered anonymously as well. But just to begin and start off, we do have a great question. Just to kind of clarify a point you made earlier, just to distinguish the difference between economic segregation and racial segregation. The comment was distinguishing between economically driven neighborhood segregation, so for example, tenements and triple deckers, and how leading to flight and generating efforts to create more vibrant, economically robust neighborhoods elsewhere. The distinguish between economically driven segregation and also racial segregation.
I'm not sure what the distinction is between economic and racial segregation that the person is alluding to, because in many respects, class and racial interests are intertwined. And let me just sort of use the issue of home buying, I think, as an example for what I mean. So yes, one could make the argument that a person will buy a home based upon their ability to afford to buy a house in a particular neighborhood, which is a function of income, credit rating, any number of factors, right? But on the one hand, we have to acknowledge the fact that any individual's income, credit rating, job, security isn't solely a function of individual effort. Again, if we go back to that poor neighborhood, right? If you're born in that neighborhood and educated in that neighborhood, you're going to get a really not quality educational experience, which is going to affect your job prospects, right? So it's not just about the individual effort that creates that set of circumstances. And when we look at sort of the phenomena of home buying in America, there's lots of data that tells us that mortgage lenders, real estate agents, all banks, all are not race blind in the way in which they make decisions about who gets a loan, what the interest rating is on that loan, and even where they steer people to purchase homes. There's some really good data that looks at sort of shoppers, right? So there's an ad about a home that's available for sale, or even a place that's available for rent, and they'll send, a white shopper and a black shopper to the same agent at different points and wait to see how the agent responds. And the agent will look at the white shopper and go, "Sure, here it is," and they'll show them the place and talk to them about the sale or the rental. And then oftentimes what the black shopper will say, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's been taken," or "Oh, that's not available." Or if it's the case of a purchase, "Oh, well, you don't want to look at a home in that neighborhood. You want to look at a home in this neighborhood instead," right? So it's not as if you can take them and tease them apart as independent of one another. They're very fundamentally, intricately connected. And if we go back to the whole claim that I made about systemic racism being about the way in which these things are sort of embedded into the structure of things, right? That, economic decisions are also made on the basis of race. Slavery was an economic decision, right? It just meant that if you were black, that you weren't going to get anything out of it, except, a very hard life and very brutal working conditions. But it was still economic, but with race being layered on top of that. I don't know if that fundamentally answers the question, but I guess I just want to sort of make it clear that even as we talk about something like home buying or renting, that it's not so easy to just say it's just economic. It is also about race. And I'll add too that the conditions that create white flight are complicated. And in fact, in the bibliography I've posted here, that I have an image of the film series Race, Power, and Illusion. I recommend people watch it. You can stream it through the library here at PC. There's an excellent episode that talks about all of this with regards to home buying and white flight. And just without going too deeply into all of this, but so when a neighborhood becomes integrated and people begin to leave the neighborhood, the surplus of housing in that neighborhood, and then the fewer the buyers buying houses in that neighborhood makes those costs go, makes the value of those homes go down. And then what happens is that you also have agents who steer people accordingly. And so this also affects the economics of why home values in white communities are higher versus home values in communities that are predominantly non-white. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The next question is, do you think the way we teach about slavery, Jim Crow laws, the civil rights movement, and MLK does little to change the systematic racism in the US? Would education or curriculum reform in this area make a difference?
Absolutely, absolutely, without a doubt. We, I've been teaching college students for over a decade, and I have been really surprised at how little most people coming out of high school know about slavery, Jim Crow. I mean, it's kind of astonishing, and not just white students, all students. When I teach about racism, and particularly about race in America, I spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the history of race in America, because, you know, and this, I think, again, what systemic racism offers, part of the story of America is a story of groups of people who were clear about the fact that they were building a nation that was just for white men, propertied white men. And they were very clear about that in so many ways, both at the start of the country and throughout its history. Um, Much of the struggle to change that has been a consequence of groups that were disenfranchised from that vision, trying to gain access to it. And I think that if you can't or don't know that, then the ability to look at why people are feeling aggrieved today gets much harder to see. And it's harder to see because what you instead believe is that any person that says they don't have something or can't achieve something is simply lazy, you know, or isn't working hard enough. You know, you look at it as an individual failing, not as a systemic process, right, that has effectively failed various people that we could do differently if we wanted to as a country.
Definitely. And we are getting a lot of questions around education. I mean, I myself am a student at Providence College, and you are a professor at Providence College. So these questions are actually related to a lot to our experiences. The next one is, how should white folks balance this need to listen and learn against putting the onus on people of color to teach them?
Well, I think listening and learning doesn't just require listening and learning from people of color, although I think that that's a piece of it. Um, Back when I was in graduate school, some colleagues of mine and I did a project where we actually talked with and interviewed whites who were anti-racist, who declared themselves anti-racist, to ask them about how they got to that stage of their lives. And in that project, one of the things that we discovered, that there was a point at which everyone recognized the need to take responsibility for their own learning. And that meant reading and going to talks like this, or putting themselves sometimes in spaces where they were where they were sometimes intellectually uncomfortable in an effort to learn and understand more. It meant for many of them at a certain point surrounding themselves with other whites who thought similarly, so that they had a sort of community of people who they could also learn from and be encouraged by. You know, I'm first and foremost a sociologist, and so I see the world through relationships and connections. I would be a heretic to my discipline if I said that I thought that any of this was something that any individual could do on their own. It's hard work, you know, and I even, when I try to teach about it, situate myself in that space by talking to students about the work I've done in my own life, right, to unlearn, you know, sexism and to unlearn misogyny. You know, that wasn't easy work, and I do it daily. You know, and so I think the same is true and certainly possible for whites who are interested in committing themselves to anti-racism as well.
Definitely, definitely. The next question we have is actually kind of towards police defunding. So, how do you understand the demand defund the police, and should we do that?
Good question. I have come to understand it as meaning several things. I think first and foremost, there are people who argue that defunding the police begins with us need to have a conversation as a society about what is it we expect police to do and what is their role in our society. We have, I think, fundamentally defaulted to police the job of dealing with every single social ill that we as a society do not want to deal with. We expect police to manage the sort of aftermath of poverty. We expect police to manage mental illness. We expect police to manage the lack of effective social supports for individuals in crisis. These are not jobs that police are well equipped to do. And we should think deeply about whether or not we should therefore take some of the resources that we give to police and put them back into things like social services programs and counseling programs and that are available to the general public and affordable for the average citizen. Healthcare alone, putting funding into healthcare alone as a public good could go a long way, I think, in that respect. So I think there's the first of that question. I think there's also a question to be asked, and if we go back to some of the things I mentioned in my talk about, to what extent do we, when we say to police departments, you can get more money if you arrest more people this year. You can have more tanks if you arrest more people this year. You can have more grenade launchers if you arrest people. To what extent is that the society we want to build? And are those resources well spent? And could we, in terms of building productive communities, take those financial resources and place them elsewhere? I know that there are some people who think that when we talk about defund the police or get rid of the police, that we're talking about anarchy. And I've not heard anyone who has made that call talking about that. There's certainly, I think, on probably the more radical end of that conversation, the notion of going more towards sort of citizen kind of security service. I couldn't say that I know enough or have thought enough about that to know what I think about that. I can see some reasons why that might be a positive idea, but a lot of reasons why I think, given the nature of our society, why that would be a really, really tragic idea. But I definitely think on the whole, the question of defunding the police gets us to really think deeply about what are police doing? How do they do it? How do we fund that? And are we, in many respects, sending the kind of message that rather than deal with poverty as a society, which we could very well do, not easily, rather than deal with drug abuse as a society, which we could very well do, but not easily, rather than do any of that, we'd rather just call the police and help and ask them to deal with it under circumstances where they think everybody is going to shoot and kill them, and therefore they shoot first. Is that really the best way to deal with that?
Definitely. Thank you. So another question we have is, can you share your thoughts on how systematic racism actually plays in college? I know it's been talked about a lot, it's been on a lot of our minds, but as students of color, as faculty and staff of color, we kind of get a different perspective of how it plays. But from outsider views, how would you think it's interpreted, as well as what are the elements in possibly knocking it down within a higher education environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably not one I can answer effectively in 3 minutes, but I'll do my best. I'm reminded years ago, sitting through a talk that the once alive scholar Manning Marable gave on this topic, and I remember somebody asked this very question, and he said, "You have to rethink the purpose, rethink the foundation." And I was like, what does that mean? It felt like I was sitting here listening to the Oracle of Delphi. And I think I've since then come to understand what he was trying to say. Higher education in America has, as its history, was an institution created to educate the elite. It was never meant to be a public enterprise. Much of what we do, how we do things, and continue to do in our culture, replicate that, sometimes in very quiet and ways. Even the idea that, getting a higher education, getting a degree is valuable toward a more productive life. Well, the more productive life we're talking about is one that's middle class and above, right? And that's not saying that middle class life is a bad thing. I'm sure most of us would probably have no problem with aspiring to middle class life. The idea being that, what does it mean then that we set people up to think about what it requires to gain entrance to that and what obligations you have to perpetuate it on the other end. We need to think about then what not only some really fundamental things like who gets into college and how we make that college more accessible as an enterprise, how we make it more affordable, um, who teaches, what we're teaching, who's represented, what topics we're willing to talk about. You know, we can't say we're preparing people for society and for the future and then be afraid to talk about race or be afraid to talk about sexism or be afraid to address, um, you know, homophobia, you know, things like that. I tell my students near the end of the semester, as we're talking in introductory sociology, demographic data tells us that by 2050, 2080, somewhere in that ballpark, it keeps shifting out a bit, we're going to become a majority non-white society. And what kind of society are we going to be when that happens? Is the question I often ask myself. And now is when we have to start thinking about that, because, you know, if we're not prepared for when that happens, I I don't know what it is that we'll expect. Um, but I think in relationship to your question, it means at least in higher education, we have to be willing to rethink everything that we do and the assumptions and the privileges that those things support and be open to rethinking and redoing it all in a very, very different way. And I know that that's maybe not a really concrete thing or a simple thing, but that's really what it takes, I think, to look at it all systemically, to be willing to say, you know, we're here where we are because of a certain trajectory in history. What if we had done it all differently? What would it look like then? And if we aren't going to be capable of having that kind of imagination, we shouldn't ask the question.
Awesome. Unfortunately, due to timing, I do have to be the bad person here and end this informative and amazing session. Dr. Chambers, I cannot thank you personally enough for be willing to spend the time, not only explaining what is systemic racism and what are the difficulties, what are the challenges behind it, and what can we do to address it, but also answering the time or spending the time to answer these questions. Unfortunately, for the people who questions were unanswered, I do have good news. The Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion will be answering these questions and posting the answers and responses online on their website, which can be located at providencecollege.com, just like the standard college website. So those questions and responses will be there. But I do want to say thank you to the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as any other campus involvement, and especially to you, Dr. Chambers. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending and listening on this wonderful session.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.
All right, with that said, we will all see you soon and good luck with everything, everybody.